Hello, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute. People are joining. We always wait till about a minute after, but we're really happy you're here with us today. And if anybody is raising their hand and you have a question, if you want to put it in the chat, that would be great. It's hard to tell exactly what the question is since everybody is muted. So if you have a question, please enter it into the chat, put your name and where you're calling in from into the chat. We'll get started very shortly. Love to see where you're calling in from. And welcome to everybody. Okay, we're going to get started. I want to welcome you to the webinar today. My name is Judy Browse, and I'm the Executive Director of the North American Association for Environmental Education, and so happy you could join us today. And thanks to all of you who've submitted questions in advance. We always like to hear what you're thinking, give it a little time to see where you are. And today we're going to be talking, as you know, about a report we just released called Mapping the Landscape of K-12 Climate Change Education Policy in the United States. And we're so excited to be working so closely with our friends at MEIS, which stands for Monitoring and Evaluating Climate Communication and Education, and the SEPN Network, which stands for the Sustainability and Education Policy Network. And all of this is with support from the WOCA Foundation. And this report is part of a larger project where we are really trying to conduct an analysis of what's going on at the state level, the federal level, on policy related to climate change education. And then we hope to report on the recommendations from this project so that we can increase climate change education in formal and non-formal institutions. This is focused on the United States, but has implications globally as we all work together on all of this. And we are so excited to work with a wonderful team from the University of Saskatchewan and the University of Melbourne, and Dr. Marcia McKenzie leads the team. She wished she could be here with us today, but she will be presenting at the NAAEE conference in October. She is fantastic, and I hope you all get to meet her at the conference if you don't know her. And then the whole team of not only Marcia, but Nicola and Kristen have been fantastic. You're going to get to hear from Kristen in a minute, who has done a ton of work to get this report done. And I'll introduce her more fully in a minute. And you'll also get to hear from Sarah Bodor, who is our Director of Policy and Affiliate Relations at NAAEE. And for those of you who are new to the webinars, we are always trying to bring new ideas, insights to our field, and getting people from both inside the field of environmental ed, and we are such a broad field, and outside, to bring new ideas to all of us so that we can all learn and share. And this is part of our eeINSPIRE webinar series, and we're so excited because it's a great partnership with the Forest Service, who are wonderful partners. And I really want to thank Rachel Baer for all she does and all her team does to support conservation education. And Rachel, I just wanted to turn it over for you to say a few words of welcome.
Oh yeah, just oh, excuse me, just so excited to have everyone with us today. This is a really exciting topic. Looking forward to hearing more about the report and the recommendations. The chat is working again, so yay. So if you didn't have a chance to see that in the chat, now have the opportunity to introduce yourselves. So welcome to everybody, and excited for the presentation today.
Thanks, Rachel, and Anne, thanks for fixing the chat. I was wondering if anybody was listening, and so I should have guessed that, oh my goodness, the chat doesn't work. Except for us. So thank you all for that. And Rachel, thank you again. And we also want to thank all our affiliate co-hosts for all that they are doing to support environmental education throughout the United States and Canada and Mexico. We love this network, and when we all point in the same direction, we can do so much. The power of this network is incredible. And please check out your affiliates if you're not connected. They're doing so much great work. And I also want to thank EPA and EE360, who are also supporting webinars and the work to bring people together to learn and share. I know everybody knows Zoom, but we are on mute. Everybody is on mute. So please ask any questions and we'll keep track of your questions in the chat, but also share any resources that you know that can help everybody as we're talking, and Kristen and Sarah, just add those into the chat and you'll get a copy of not only the chat, but a copy of the recording and a copy of a PDF of the PowerPoint. So you'll get all these resources in case you miss things, because there's a lot that we're going to cover today. And we also have live captioning for those of you who need help with audio. Thanks to our captioner for doing that. It really, really helps. And I also want to give a big thank you to Ann Umali, who does so much, our webinar guru who figured out the chat. And thank you for all you do. And she is our Director of Professional Development and manages EE360 as well. And as you know, today we're going to talk about the K through 12 policy analysis, which is fantastic. But I just wanted to give you a high level on some of the other components of this project. And as part of this effort, we also wanted to get a sense, kind of a pulse of what teachers and administrators are thinking about climate education and climate policy. And so we are working on a teacher and administrator survey with EDGE and so many other partners. And EDGE Research is such a great group. And what they are doing is helping us with a representative sample of 800 teachers and administrators. And that survey was released about a week and a half ago. And then at the same time, we are sending this survey out more widely, and we would love your help. And Anne is going to put a link in the chat. We want more K through 12 teachers and administrators. So we're going to compare the results we get from the representative sample and from our broader network to see what people are thinking and doing. And then we'll be analyzing that data and sharing it with you in the future. And then we started with the K through 12 landscape analysis, but Kristen is right now hard at work on the higher ed landscape analysis, and we will be hearing about that as well shortly, along with the survey. We're really excited to see those results. And then we also are working on a non-formal education survey, which is looking at what are community-based organizations doing with climate education, climate policy. And in addition, we are going to be thinking about some case studies that will highlight some of the barriers, some of the positive stories, how climate justice is integrated into our climate education work. And so that will be coming up. And we'd love to ask all of you, if you have ideas for what you think might be a good case study, we'd really love to hear from you. So let us know about that. And finally, NAAEE is doing a lot on climate literacy and climate justice in addition to these analyses. And so I hope you'll check out some of the other things that we have, like the Coalition for Climate Education Policy. Sarah might talk more about that. Our EE Pro discussion group, we're working on a new set of guidelines on climate change and climate justice. So lots in the works, and we'll put a lot of this in the links in the chat so you can find out more about some of the other things that are taking place. So lots going on. We're really excited about all of this. And I'm really, really happy to introduce our speakers today who can share the results of the report that we just released, Kristen and Sarah. I want to introduce them both at the same time so we can just keep going. And I will start with Kristen. Kristen is a research associate with the Monitoring and Evaluating Climate, Communication, and Education. And from now on, we'll say MEIS because it's a lot easier. And it's coordinating work on the US landscape policy analysis in collaboration with us and working with a number of other advisors to do this report. In addition to the K through 12 reports we're focusing on today, Kristen is also working on the report on higher education, which is another wonderful analysis of looking at what's happening in higher ed. Kristen is also a PhD candidate in the School of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Saskatchewan. Her research uses practice theory to explore how climate change education could and should be conceptualized at K through 12 schools, including in relation to psychosocial, cognitive, and action-oriented learning dimensions. She also uses a whole institution approach to climate change education in her research, which includes climate change education within teaching and learning, school governance, facilities and operations, and community partnerships. And she has provided research assistance on a range of research projects conducted by the Sustainability and Education Policy Network, including several UNESCO consultancies and CEPIN's Canadian Landscape Policy Analysis. So we're thrilled you could be here with us, Kristen, today. And then Sarah is our wonderful Director of Policy and Affiliate Relations. She is NAAE's liaison to our state and regional affiliate organizations who make up a network of support for environmental educators across North America. She also leads our advocacy efforts on behalf of environmental education, and she works with partners and thought leaders to identify policy priorities and design state and federal strategy to advance environmental and climate literacy. Sarah also manages the Superintendent's Environmental Education Collaborative and the Coalition for Climate Education Policy. And before becoming to NAAE, she works at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and she did so many things while she was there, including coordinating the No Child Left Inside grassroots coalition of more than 2,200 organizations focusing on generating public and private support for the development and implementation on statewide environmental literacy plans. So we are so excited to have both Kristen and Sarah here with us today, and I'm going to turn it over to Kristen. Welcome.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And I'll just share my screen with you guys. Right. All right. So you should be able to see that, hopefully. All right. So thanks so much, Judy, for that introduction. As Judy mentioned, the MEIS project has been collaborating with NAAE to conduct a U.S. policy landscape analysis. And so today I'm going to talk about one of the components of this work, which is the K-12 policy analysis. But before I do that, I will introduce a bit about what the MEIS project is. So the MEIS project is an international collaboration of over 100 academics and organizations that are working to improve the quality and quantity of climate change education through 3 axes of project activity. That includes innovative case studies from around the world of innovative climate change education, data sets and indicator development, as well as targeted mobilization of that data through outputs such as learning institutes and a data visualization platform. We're also collaborating with partners on other projects related to climate change education, such as this work with the NAAEE that I'll talk about today. So the objective of the K-12 policy analysis was to examine the education policies for the extent and type of climate change education within the documents. And when we say policy, we mean official policy documents, such as strategic plans, state standards, and environmental literacy plans, et cetera. And we wanted to do this in order to benchmark how and whether states were including climate change content in their policies to motivate further climate action and education. Past MEIS project work has also found that the presence of policies does make it more likely that sustainability and climate change education will exist in practice. In terms of the sample that we used, we collected documents from all 50 states and Washington, D.C. We only collected documents from public state level departments or boards of education, so no private education or local authorities. And in total, we collected 802 documents between May to August of 2021. In order to collect and analyze the documents, we used a whole institution approach, which meant that we collected policy documents from all of these whole institution domains, overall governance. So that includes including climate action and planning related to climate change education or climate action, and included documents such as strategic plans. We also looked at teaching and learning. So that involves including climate change education in all subjects. Example documents would be state standards and curriculum frameworks. We also looked at facilities and operations. So that involves working towards climate mitigation and adaptation within school buildings and grounds, with example documents being operations plans. We also looked at community partnerships. So that involves the school partnering with the community for climate change education, and example documents being community partnership plans. In terms of our methods, the policy materials were assigned attributes so that we could look at climate change inclusion in relation to a range of characteristics such as document type, state, subject, etc. And we use climate change related keywords to identify the climate change content using the qualitative analysis program in Vivo 12. And while we were developing the methods for this report, we consulted with climate change education experts from academic, professional, and policy sectors who made up an advisory committee for the report. And the report was also reviewed by climate change education experts before it was published. The keywords that are listed here, or the keywords are listed here. We analyzed the climate change and energy related keywords separately, and I'll talk a little bit more about why we did that later. So in terms of our findings, our first finding was that of the 802 education policies analyzed, only 17% mentioned climate change at least once. And within the policies with climate change content, climate change was discussed an average of 3 times per policy with considerable variance across the different policies. So for instance, Indiana's policies mentioned climate change an average of 42 times per policy across 13 documents, whereas policies from Utah had the lowest mentions of climate change with only 5 mentions across 25 documents. And the high number of mentions in Indiana was due to a recent release of a climate change education framework. Our second finding was that when climate change content was mentioned within any policy analyzed, it was most often within a sustainability specific operations plan versus a more general operations plan and or an environmental literacy plan. However, those 2 types of policies were rare, and only 3% of the collected policies were of either type, and fewer than half of those specifically mentioned climate change. We also found that many environmental literacy plans were quite dated. We did find some bright spots within teaching and learning policies. For example, in Washington, D.C.'s environmental literacy plan, they began by situating the plan within the context of the global climate strikes, as well as other social justice movements. The Maryland Environmental Literacy Plan also mentioned that their website hosts resources for climate change education, such as lessons and unit plans for all grade levels. When looking at the whole institution domain of the policies, we found that 90% of the time climate change content was mentioned, it was in a teaching and learning policy. This included documents such as state standards, curriculum frameworks, environmental literacy plans, and teaching and learning plans. All 50 states and Washington, D.C. had climate change content in at least one teaching and learning policy. 8 jurisdictions had climate change content in operations policies. Only 1 state had climate change content in a governance policy, and no jurisdictions had any climate change content in a community partnership policy. Our fourth finding was that when climate change content was mentioned in the standards, it was usually in environment or climate change specific standards or science standards. Climate change content was also included in social studies standards, but it was much less frequently done, and climate change was rarely included in language arts standards, and no climate change content was found in mathematics standards. In looking at the content of the climate change content within the standards and curriculum frameworks, we did also find that the presence of content did not always indicate support for teaching climate change education. For instance, in South Dakota, climate change was only mentioned to let the reader know that the topic, along with evolution, was something that should be taught at home and not at school. Our fifth finding was that states often used or were influenced by outside policies when creating their own state standards or curriculum framework documents. So for science and environment, climate change specific subjects, policies that either used or were influenced by the next generation science standards were more likely to include climate change content than those that were produced by the state. Social studies standards that were influenced by the college, career, and civic life framework were only slightly more likely to include climate change content than state-produced documents, but they were more likely to have more meaningful outcomes, such as mentioning climate change as more than just an example in a list of concepts. And math and language arts standards that were influenced by the Common Core were the least likely to have climate change content. We also analyzed state standards and curriculum frameworks to determine how climate change was discussed within the documents. And within state standards and curriculum frameworks, 22% of the time climate change content was mentioned, it was only done so as an example concept. We also found that climate change content usually only included a focus on the cognitive dimension of climate change, such as understanding the climate science. Standards less frequently discussed the socio-emotional components of climate change. When they did, it was usually in relation to preparing students to talk about climate change versus how to deal with emotions related to climate change or developing emotional resilience. It was rare for standards to include a focus on action as well. When it was included, it was usually in relation to planning for action versus actually taking action. In relation to including a more holistic focus on climate change education learning, a bright spot was found in New Jersey. Not only did they recently commit to including climate change education across all subjects, but an analysis of their standards also indicated a focus on the cognitive, socio-emotional, and action-oriented dimensions of climate change education. For example, this quote mentions that students should develop an action plan to address climate change that they can share with their school or local community. And they're also asked to propose or defend a public policy related to climate change and asked to investigate a global issue such as climate change and share that information with others. Of the policies analyzed, 16% had energy content. Upon closer analysis, we found that only 14% of that energy-focused content was located within one paragraph of the word climate. So this suggested that discussions of energy were not often associated with climate change. For these reasons, the energy content was analyzed separately from the climate change content for the rest of the studies. And within the policies analyzed, climate change was often discussed in relation to both renewable and non-renewable energy. And then the states that had the most energy content were Indiana, Rhode Island, and Louisiana. Through our analysis, we also found a lack of focus on climate justice within the documents, and very few mentions of climate action, climate mitigation, or adaptation, with one exception mentioning climate justice being found in New Jersey, as well as several other states. We also found little mention of climate change content in relation to land-based education or Indigenous knowledges. We did find an exception in North Carolina where climate change was discussed in relation to how Indigenous knowledge systems can help with describing climate change impacts, especially in relation to changes in cultural practices, precipitation patterns, and species extinction. And then our eighth and final finding was that the majority of climate change content was from Democrat states with their political affiliation determined by their state governor affiliation, and mayor affiliation was used for Washington, D.C. And we also found that jurisdictions with overall climate plans were more than twice as likely to have climate change content in their education policies. All right, so I'll turn it over here to Sarah to talk about the recommendations.
Thanks so much, Kristen. We included a set of recommendations based on these findings in our full report, and you can see them here. They're really at a high level and they're quite broad, but I just want to review them quickly. First of all, I think that all the findings show that we need to increase the quantity and the quality of climate change content across all education policies, because even in the areas that Kristen mentioned, with the highest appearance of climate change education content, those appearances were still quite low or infrequent in terms of saturation of education policies. Also, Kristen talked about the number of environmental literacy plans that included climate change content. And while those plans were more likely than other types of policies to include climate change content, we were quite surprised at how low that number was. And I think that is related to the fact that, as Kristen pointed out, many of those plans are quite dated. And the way that we talk about climate change has changed pretty dramatically in the last 5 years, and probably even more so in the last 2 to 3 years. And so there's a real opportunity to really better anchor climate change education as a priority within statewide environmental literacy plans. We also are really pushing for a stronger focus on climate justice, climate action, and the incorporation of Indigenous knowledges in these education policies, as well as Kristen just added, including a much stronger focus on climate change mitigation and adaptation, and not just on sort of climate science in the content policies. And then finally, we are starting to see some movement on this last bullet and around providing stronger policy support, such as funding, professional development, and staffing to help to advance climate change education. A number of states have begun to budget for professional development specifically related to ensuring teachers are better prepared to teach about climate change in the classroom, and that's a really exciting development. Kristen, if you want to go to the next slide. So if you've had a chance to take a look at our report, you see that we've also included a list of potential policy implications. This gets a little bit more into the specifics based on those really high level recommendations. And so in the report, we have a number of suggested strategies and tactics by policy type. And I won't read through them all. There's actually quite a bit more detail in here in the actual report. So I would encourage you to take a look. And this is not even an exhausted list. And I think it would be really interesting to hear from you all and from folks in other settings about what you're seeing work well at the state level, as well as what new ideas you might have. But in governance, we can really look, I think, much more closely at how climate change education can be included in other types of strategic planning policies, and really embedding a focus on climate change in the mission, vision, and values of state boards of education and state departments of education. There's also a real opportunity to make sure that we are incorporating education targets and school-based targets in our climate action plans. Next slide. And then on teaching and learning, which I suspect, and this may not be true for all of you, but I'm gonna suspect that this may feel like a more obvious area for change and growth to many of us participating in this webinar today, who might be dealing more with content and standards. But hopefully there are some ideas here that might spark new thinking or innovation. I think particularly from my perspective, it's interesting to see how little focus on the social emotional learning and the need for students to have to build their social emotional resilience as they learn about climate change is an area that I'm hoping we'll see greater investment and more thinking, as well as the need to really connect states and districts more with Indigenous educators who can really teach students new ways of approaching climate change and land-based education. But as we go through these, I'm hoping, I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat, and we will definitely get to some questions in just a couple of minutes, but I'd encourage you to also add the ideas that you have, or things, as I said, that you might already be seeing in the chat, so that we can continue to share ideas. Also, before we go to the next slide, I just want to underscore what Kristen said towards the very end there, about the lack of action-oriented learning that we're seeing in these education policies. And I know that many of you are working really deeply with students and others in how to take community-based climate action. And we know that this is so important to helping students develop a sense of agency to address the climate crisis. Let's go to the next one. So facilities and operations, I think, again, we are seeing some improvements in the way that investments in school renovation and new school construction might be geared towards helping promote sustainability. The bipartisan infrastructure bill that passed recently included not insignificant funding for electrification of school buses, for example. And there are opportunities, I think, to make sure that that funding is spent to really help support the highest need schools across the country. And many of those decisions will be made at the state and local level. There's also, I think, a lot of work that can be done to better connect existing operational plans to existing climate action plans, or to ensure that when new operational plans or revisions to existing operation plans are being considered, that they are linking directly to climate action plans. And certainly where there is no climate action plan, it's important to move towards the development of one. And then the next slide, and the last sort of policy type, is another one that I think is really exciting for folks who work in the environmental education sector and the climate education sector, which is around community partnerships. If you caught what Kristen said about there being no policies that focused on community partnerships with climate change education content included, there's just an incredible room for growth and opportunity here. And we know, as we see the stresses that schools have been under for the last several years, which seem to only be becoming more and more challenging, that there's just a significant role for community-based partnerships, that non-formal institutions can do quite a bit to help close gaps and to step in and address barriers through really strong partnerships that can be funded at the state level. And I will just say that I know part of funding that was just allocated in the state of Maine to support teacher professional development for climate change education included also grant funding to support just that, to support strong community partnerships with schools and school districts to advance climate literacy. And I think this is a model that we can look to replicate and scale in other parts of the country. And I believe that's the last slide on the recommendations and policy implications. I hope that you will be in touch with both the research team and NAAEE to continue this conversation. And there's, again, a link to the K-12 administrators and teachers survey. We'd really love to have broad response to that survey. So do encourage you to share it with your formal education communities. And I know it was said in the chat, but just as a reminder, there's a lot of dense content on these slides, and we will be sharing both the slides and the recording with everyone participating in the webinar or who registered for the webinar. So you can go back and take another look at some of the findings and recommendations, as well as hopefully download the full report and executive summary. And I'm going to turn it back to you, Anne, because I think there are some questions.
Yeah, there are a number of questions, but Sarah, I just wanted to say one thing about the report, and thank you and Kristen so much. It's definitely been a team effort, and Nicola is also on the line, and she was so helpful in all of this. But one thing I wanted to mention, somebody talked about maybe doing another report in 2025. If this is a baseline, as we've talked about, this is getting a sense of that. But the data is already out of date. it doesn't show up for a while. So some of the innovative work that's going on in New Jersey, for example, doesn't quite rise to the top when we did this analysis. So we're hoping that this could be a regular thing that we can update so that we can learn what's happening and also tweak some of the questions and things that we might be looking at, like the US territories and whatever, to make it as helpful as possible. But Anne, do you want to go with the first question? I have a list of them as well. Do you want to jump in?
Sure. I have a couple of questions here. So many great questions in the chat. But first, thank you, Sarah and Kristen, for this. So much information to digest. So Judy did mention like the possibility of looking at data again in the future. But in addition to data gathering, there were a lot of questions about how can educators support this effort. For example, James is asking, how can students, teachers, and informal educators that are leaders in climate education and action better help policy analysts going forward? Do you have any recommendations for folks like James?
Yeah, I think anytime we can get students and teachers involved in policymaking processes, that's only going to be to the advantage. I know that there's a lot of resources out there now that are helping even students, draft policies as well, and getting them right involved from the beginning of this is what we want to see, and using resources like the report to say this is specifically what we want to see. We want to see this kind of whole institution approach where we're creating this culture of climate action, or we're including focus on action, and we're including focus on socio-emotional components. And so yeah, if your state's not doing it, then getting students involved in putting something forward and saying this is what we want, I think is one way forward.
Thanks for that. And one more question related to professional development. Sarah, you mentioned that you're seeing just that increase in states that are supporting funding for professional development. And I know in the chat, we've mentioned Maine and Washington. Sarah and Kristen, are you aware of other states that are doing this well as far as providing funding to support professional development?
I'm not aware of any others. I don't know if you are, Sarah.
So yes, I know that there has been a flurry of policy activity in California and some funding allocated to support teacher professional development. There is and I always hesitate when I talk about state-specific stuff because I know that the leaders of these initiatives are on this webinar and I don't want to misspeak, but they're also doing a call for open source resources to help support teaching and learning about climate change education with a specific focus on climate justice. New Jersey's process has been unfolding for quite some time since they revised their standards to incorporate age-appropriate climate change education into every subject area. And there is funding being allocated to support the implementation of those standards. I suspect that we will see more and more of that. There are a number of initiatives that have been proposed in state legislatures that just didn't make it over the finish line recently. And I think that those will continue to be moved forward. And I will say that because we know, in part because we know and understand that at the same time that you're collecting this data, as Judy said, states are moving forward, things are evolving and changing, and you can't capture that in this type of a paper. We're also doing kind of one-page summaries of the successful legislative efforts. And we've got a couple of those, Washington and Maine. Those are complete. We'll be posting those on our website shortly. And I know somebody mentioned the student-led effort in Berkeley, and we're doing an interview with folks involved in that effort to write up a one-pager on that in the coming days, and trying to really highlight some of these key pieces that folks are mentioning in the chat, like the role of student activism and student voice and student leadership, so that we can start to sort of look at what are some of the key components of these successful efforts and what folks should be looking for in order to help them advance a successful effort in their own state or jurisdiction.
And thanks, Sarah. And Kristen, one of the other things we will be doing are these more in-depth case studies that we hope to highlight some of the positive things that are happening, as well as how states are overcoming some of the barriers, and the question about how can teachers and students help. It's not only that they can lead efforts, they can also support the champions in a state. And I know in New Jersey, there was a high-level champion with Tammy Murphy, the wife of the governor, and she had a lot of support from educators that wanted to see something happen. So there are all different ways that make a difference in a state to advance this work. We had another question from Carolyn, and I wonder, Sarah and Kristen, if you want to jump in on, you were just talking about it, Sarah, with New Jersey, about how do we influence non-STEM teachers and not just focus on the science? How do we get other civic engagement, writing, language arts? How do we do this cross-disciplinary effort with climate change education? And how do we think about that in terms of the recommendations for this report and next steps?
Yeah, I think that's definitely tied to what we were just talking about with professional development. I think the key thing is one of the things we hear a lot is that, you know, teachers struggle to find resources or struggle to find like how to teach this in the subject that I'm working in, or how to do this. So having that professional development where you can include a focus of what that looks like, using resources like Subject to Climate, that's doing that, that's helping provide some of those resources, and having that conversation to move from just talking about the climate science to more holistic engagement with it.
One of the other things that we have done is we have an ongoing fellowship on linking environmental education and civic engagement. And we are thinking of, in the future, if we have another fellowship, to link climate and civic engagement and environmental ed, because it's so important to make this cross-disciplinary and to think about going beyond the science classroom. Although the science is critical to everything we're doing, so is everything else and all the other disciplines. And so that whole school approach, the whole curriculum approach, is so important. Let's see, what were other questions, Anne?
There's another question here from Alex. And hi, Alex. And he says that research shows that teachers feel more agency when they act on goals that are important to them and are willing to implement in their teaching practices if they contribute to their expertise. And so the question for the two of you is if you know of any policies that you found that enable teachers to influence climate change curricula, content, and school-based actions. It's a long question.
Yeah, nothing is coming to top of mind. One of the things that we did look at was if the policies were talking about outcomes related to climate change education, or if they were also talking about pedagogy as well, and trying to give support for those types of teaching methods as well. And it was much often more outcomes focused than pedagogy. So definitely some room for improvement there in terms of giving teachers resources for teaching about these topics and in these ways.
We don't know, obviously, until we get the results, but I think we're really hoping that there will be some things that come out of this teacher survey too that will help us be able to kind of make some assertions about the sorts of support and resources that teachers are looking for, potentially some disparities between their value of climate change as a priority for teaching and learning versus, you know, the support that they might feel like they have, or the time that they might have to teach it in the classroom. We'll just have to wait and see. But we're hopeful.
So Carmen just added, if you can look at that, the vocabulary, and there's been a lot of work looking at the red and blue states and language, and how certain language turns certain groups off. Sarah, Kristen, anything you want to add to that on how we can broaden our support, and what you thought, Kristen, as you were gathering this data from the red and blue states, if things jumped out at you?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think there is a lot more that could be done to look at that specifically. But like one of the interesting things I remember, and I can't remember which state it was in, but in some states they referred to, I think it was long-term changes in climate change, and then others it was long-term changes in climate. So it was like they used the same word, but instead of saying climate change, it was changes in climate. So yeah, definitely saw some of those linguistic differences across different red and blue states. We didn't go into that analysis too much in particular, but did see some of that, and it would be something that would be really interesting to follow up in later versions of a similar type of data collection.
I totally agree. I mean, I think that as we're seeing in this conversation, and just as we've looked at the findings of this report, there's so much more work to build out and so much more that we can do to sort of expand our ability to understand what's happening across the country. I do know that our colleagues at NOAA, one in particular, has been talking a lot with leaders in states across the country, and his observation is that there are places where good things are happening from an education standpoint, but they're, you know, very deliberately not going to use some of the vocabulary that we might use. And so it might take a little bit of digging beyond some of what we've done here. But again, as Kristen indicated, I think that's where these pockets of innovation and kind of looking at some places where interesting things are happening, it would do us well to kind of look at some of those examples.
And you two final questions, and these had come in earlier from some of you who thought about the webinar in advance, which is great. Somebody asked about the analysis of educational materials that deal with the role of fossil fuels in all of this. And Kristen, I know when you were thinking of energy, you know, you can look for words and think about things, and it depends on how it's used and who is using them. So anything you want to say just about the fossil fuel industry and this report and what we might do in the future?
Yeah, I mean, it would be really interesting to take a deeper dive into some of the additional curriculum resources that are provided, and are they being put out by fossil fuel industries, and if they are, how is climate change talked about within those documents versus ones that aren't, especially because of, you know, our finding with the energy that I found quite interesting that, you know, energy content wasn't always climate supportive, and, you know, we analyzed it separately because of that. So I think there's a lot more to dig in there for future analyses as well.
We also, thanks for that, Kristen, we also actually had a number of questions that supported this, including, could we highlight the students that are already implementing some of these recommendations in the case studies and in the work that we're doing in the future? And then one last question, can public outdoor space be used by state and private schools to foster climate awareness and inspire positive action? So I know that's a little bit outside of the realm, but any thoughts on that, given all the work we've done on trying to support these outdoor spaces?
Oh yeah, I mean, fostering connection to place is really important, especially for younger students, but really students of all ages, because once you have those connections, you're just going to fight even more to protect the earth and the planets. Lots of opportunities there as well to connect with Indigenous land-based educators. I mean, place-based learning is all about, you know, seeing the local community as a source of knowledge. So anytime you're out there observing, you know, ecosystem processes or human nature relationships, you know, the global carbon cycle can be a really daunting topic, but you can understand it if you go out and watch local plants grow and die, or watch earthworms turn leaves to soil, which can lead to questions about stored carbon. And you can observe how cities are zoned by walking around and having conversations about how cities might be able to be designed differently to be more climate friendly. So you can do lots of creative things, and there's, I think, a lot of value in bringing in place.
And I would just add that I think that, it also just sort of speaks to the design principles that we would like to see, applied to school grounds, so that you are both making the school grounds more sustainable, healthier for students and staff to spend time, while also potentially creating really rich learning environments. And it's so hard to be having this conversation today when it's like 90 degrees outside my home, and thinking about the fact that my kids just started back to school this week, and how little sort of shaded outdoor space they have on their school ground to spend time during the school day. And it's a simple concept, one that we're all really super familiar with, but we know that there are schools that are having to close this week around the country, and certainly around the globe, because of the impacts of climate related weather and disasters. And if we're making our schoolyards more resilient to prevent that type of learning loss, we're also creating better connections to the land that Kristen described, and those opportunities to learn outside.
Well, thanks to both of you. I also saw in the chat something about climate emotions, and we did do a webinar several months ago, and that's in our archive. We'll turn it over to Anne in a second to wrap us up, but any final thoughts, Sarah or Kristen, before we turn it over to Anne?
No, just thanks everyone for joining, and I hope you can check out the report and stay tuned, because the higher ed report's coming out very soon as well too. So thanks everyone.
Thanks, Kristen. So happy you could be here. Sarah, any final thoughts?
Yes, final thoughts, Sarah.
I'm just really excited to be able to share these recommendations and findings with all of you. And I hope that you will keep in touch and stay tuned for the next pieces of this project as it unfolds, and continue to feed your ideas in, because, as I said, there's so much more we can do. And we want to learn more about these incredible stories.
Thank you. So we are going to close today like we close all of our webinars, and that is with more invitations to connect and learn with all of us and our networks. And the first one is, come see us on EE Pro. Judy mentioned a past webinar that might be relevant for some of you, where we talk about climate emotions. If you got anything out of this webinar, and if you want to check out our archive, head over to EE Pro. You can see our entire collection available online for free. Head over to the learning section of EE Pro, and that section, monthly webinar series, where that red arrow is where you'll find everything you need. And then the next invitation is that I hope all of you will join us in Tucson this October. After 2 long years of virtual conferences, we are finally back in person in Tucson, October 12th to the 15th for our regular conference. And then right before that, the 11th and 12th for our research symposium. And if you register before September 9th, you can take advantage of early bird registration discounts. So check it out. And one speaker I want to highlight in particular is that we are going to have Dr. Robin Wall-Kimmerer joining us on Thursday of the conference. Many of you probably already know her. She's incredible. She's the author of Braiding Sweetgrass. And she's going to be joining us Thursday, sharing all kinds of knowledge with us, and really excited to have her there. And then this final slide shows just a smattering of some of the speakers, keynotes, and flash talks that we've got planned for all of you. Some of them are young. There are 30 under 30 award winners from this year. And some of them are, I won't say old, but some of them are seasoned professionals in the field that are receiving awards, that have done so much over decades. And I hope you can join us. We've got lots of folks, lots of interesting backgrounds to join, to share together. And then we really think you're going to love Tucson. We've got some really cool pre-conference workshops planned at the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum. And the venue is just spectacular. Beautiful desert, mountains. We've got an incredible hotel and conference venue, and you will be so pleased. So we hope to see you there and hope to see you in person. We do have virtual options available if you can't join us in Tucson. And if we don't see you there, we will see you on another webinar soon. So thanks again for joining us. Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Sarah and Kristen. And thanks to all of you for spending the last hour with us. And we will see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.